The Ramapuram tiger. This is the story of a tiger that for 3 months held sway over nearly half a district, an area some 60 miles long by another 60 or so broad. Although his reign was comparatively short, it was nevertheless hectic, for during this short time the Ramapuram tiger was literally here, there and everywhere within the 3,600 square miles of his domain. Like the Scarlet Pimpernel, he was sought by all, yet found by none, till his end came in an unexpected manner. The district of North Coimbatore is largely made up of hills and forest. Bounded on the south by the low-lying plains of Coimbatore proper, it rises abruptly to the Dimbum escarpment. On the southwest are the jungles of the Nilgiri or Blue Mountain Range. On the west, the forests of Mysore. To the northwest is another high range of hills, the Bilagiri Rangans. Northeast and eastwards flows the Cauvery River, clothed on both its banks with heavy jungle, the northeastern and eastern portions abutting on the forests of the district of Salem. There is only one town worthy of that name in the district of North Coimbatore, Kollegal, which lies at the northwestern corner, scarcely 8 miles from the Cauvery. 4 roads branch out of Kollegal. Those that run westwards and northwards into Mysore play no part in this story. The third leads southwards and is more or less straight, and runs along the eastern base of the Bilagiri Rangan hills. 17 miles along this road brings one to the large village of Lockenhawley. 13 miles beyond Lockenhawley is Bailur, where the bison range begins and reaches to Hassanpur at the 48th milestone, and to Dimbum, at the top of the escarpment, 52 miles from Kollegal. The fourth road leads in a southeasterly direction, and cuts through the village of Ramapuram, about 25 miles from Kollegal, where it turns southwards and leads to Baga, 24 miles further on, then to Tamarakarai, another 5 miles, and finally to the southeastern end of the Dimbum escarpment, where it drops sharply to the village of Andior on the plains. This road totals about 81 miles in length. The Kollegal Lockenhawley Bailur Dimbum road carried sparse lorry traffic and a daily bus service. Whereas the road to Ramapuram, Tamarakari and Andiur was unfit for motor traffic, except jeeps or old-fashioned high-clearance American cars, over the last 60 miles of its length. The terrain is fearful, consisting of sharp rising and falling gradients strewn with boulders. It becomes a narrow track, cut deeply by the wheels of bullock carts, and hemmed in on both sides by dense forest. The sandy and often rocky beds of forest, streams cross and recross this track at intervals. In the deeper valleys vast areas of the mighty bamboo prevail, the drooping stems touching the hood of the car, as it labors and chugs along in low gear, with its radiator invariably boiling. Occasionally a fallen bamboo stem, or the broken branch of a tree, lies across the track, torn down to appease the ravenous appetite of an elephant. The driver then halts, and with his axe, or chopper, as it is here called, cuts away the obstruction and drags it aside, then moves on until he meets another similar obstruction. Without the handy chopper, this track would be impassable. Tigers normally dislike very dense vegetation, and keep to low scrub jungle, but it is preferred by elephants and bison. The tiger has various reasons for its preference, one being that almost impenetrable undergrowth prevents the tiger from carefully stalking his prey, and hinders his terribly effective last-minute charge. Another reason is that the tiger's legitimate prey, deer of all kinds, wild pig and of course, village cattle, do not enter very dense jungle, which is mainly inhabited by elephants and bison, of which the tiger generally keeps clear. A third reason is that thick undergrowth harbors insect pests, such as leeches, many species of animal ticks, and the horse or animal fly, as it is called in India. Tigers have a great aversion to these pests. The Ramapuram man-eater was reported to have come from the banks of the Cauvery River, from the region of a mountain, known as Ponakai Malai, over 6,000 feet in altitude. A few minor coffee estates, owned by Soligas and other Indian planters, exist on the slopes of this mountain. It is said that the Ramapuram man-eater began his career as an ordinary cattle lifter, that made a habit of raiding these estates for what he could pick up, in the way of domestic cattle belonging to the planters and the coolies. He is reported to have killed and eaten several cattle, till one planter, more enterprising than his fellows, went down to Coimbatore city and purchased a gin trap, of truly formidable appearance. This trap was made of iron with two semicircular rows of teeth, which when opened and held apart, had a spread of almost 2.5 feet. The teeth were about 2 inches long. The jaws were kept apart by a hair trigger arrangement, which, when released, allowed an exceptionally powerful spring to bring the jaws noisily together at lightning speed, so that the wicked teeth meshed with each other. Soon afterwards, the tiger killed a milch cow which it dragged into a ravine, and concealed beneath a heap of dried leaves, without starting to feed. The kill was followed and discovered, and the trap was carefully set near the hindquarters of the cow, at which place the tiger would normally start operations, when he returned for his meal. The same dried leaves, that concealed the kill were used to hide the trap. The tiger returned, and to his bad luck and the future ill fortune of others got his head in the trap, which caught him firmly on both sides of the neck, just behind the ears. The trap had been anchored to the ground with a stake. The tiger tore at the trap and succeeded in uprooting the stake, while the jaws held firm in his neck. He then rushed away into the jungle, dragging the heavy trap with him, till at a spot almost 2 miles distant, the trap got itself firmly wedged between two big rocks. The tiger tried to drag itself free, but only succeeded in wedging the trap more firmly than before. The tiger roared with pain, and struggled desperately. The roars were heard for half the night by the planter and his frightened coolies, 2 miles away at their plantation. Finally, the animal broke loose, losing its left ear and eye in the process, with very severe injuries to the rest of the neck and face. It was heard in the area, moaning with pain night and day for quite a week afterwards. Then came a period of absolute silence. Everyone thought the tiger had died of its wounds. The planter and his hirelings kept a careful watch for vultures, who would doubtless spot the carcass, and betray the whereabouts of the dead animal by swooping to earth for their meal. But, the only vultures seen were those soaring in the high heavens, carefully scanning the earth below for the signs of death, but none swooped, for the very good reason that the tiger was not dead. A fortnight passed, then one afternoon, along the path to one of the smaller coffee estates, climbed Jekan Soliga, a native of Tamil, and his 18-year-old spouse. In accordance with the established Indian custom, Jekan walked in front, with the woman about a yard behind him, carrying a sack of grain balanced on her head. They had crossed a dry streambed, and were just climbing its slight embankment, when, out of a clump of grass like sugarcane, that grows only along river banks in these areas, a tiger pounced upon the girl, throwing her to the earth. Turning, Jekan saw his wife lying on the ground gazing at him with terror-stricken, pleading eyes. The tiger crouched upon her back, its 2 paws overlapping her shoulders, the wide-open mouth just above her head. It was a tiger with no left eye, and no left ear, while the wounds on its neck and face had not yet healed. Jekan was turned to stone. He could not move and he could not speak, but remained rooted to the spot in horror and amazement. The tiger snarled horribly, contorting its already lacerated features into a still more horrible mask. Then, it grabbed the girl by her right shoulder and walked across the stream with its prey. The girl hung head downwards, her loose hair and left arm and legs dragging in the sand. A moment later, the tiger and the girl had disappeared in the jungle on the further side. Evidently the poor woman had swooned, or may already have died of fright. That was the last Jekan ever saw of his wife, nor had she uttered the slightest cry, even at the moment of attack. A month later a herd boy was killed by a tiger, within 2 miles of Ramapuram. In this case the half-eaten remains were found in a bush. The third human kill occurred about 3 weeks later, almost at the 21st milestone on the Kollegal Lokhanholi Bailur Dimbam road. This time it was a road coolie, a middle-aged woman, who was attacked in full view of her companions, just before 5 in the evening. She had stopped work for a few minutes, and had gone some yards into the jungle, when a tiger pounced upon her, as if from nowhere, and carried her away. She had screamed frenziedly, and those who were in the vicinity had clearly seen the tiger. It had a scarred face and no left ear or eye. It so happened that my game license for the North Coimbatore area had at that time expired. This area is divided into two forest divisions, North Coimbatore proper and the Kollegal division. For although Kollegal fell within North Coimbatore district for administrative purposes, the forest department had recently subdivided the district into two distinct forest divisions. My license, which had expired, covered North Coimbatore proper and Dimbam, while Lockenhawley, Balia and Ramapuram fell within the Kollegal division. I had intended renewing my old license, and was about to send the required fee, when I read in the papers about the latest outrage committed by this tiger. That decided me, and with 10 days privilege leave at my disposal, I left Bangalore early in the morning, reaching the forest department office at Kollegal, 87 miles away, even before it had opened for the day. It did not take me long to get the required shooting license, and all available information regarding the tiger. The area where the man-eater had operated was comparatively new to me, so I decided for a start, to camp in the small forest lodge at Ramapuram, 25 miles away, which I reached in an hour and a half, after negotiating an extremely bumpy road. Obviously, the first thing to do was to try and win the confidence of the inhabitants of Ramapuram by telling them I had come to try to rid them of the tiger. The people did not know me and gave somewhat garbled accounts, indicating that the tiger might be anywhere between Ponakaimalai, where it had struck down its first victim, and Bailur, a distance of about 60 miles as the crow flies. Bailur, as I have told you, was a small village some 30 miles from Kollegal, on the Kollegal-Lockenhawley-Dimbam road. Thus, I could either return to Kollegal by car and motor thence to Bailur, or I could leave the car at Ramapuram, and cover the third side of the triangle by walking from Ramapuram to Bailur, a distance of nearly 19 miles. I decided to follow the latter course, as it would give me the opportunity of passing through several forest hamlets bordering the reserved forest, where I hoped to get some news of the tiger. Accordingly, at dawn next morning I left the little forest lodge at Ramapuram, and began my walk to Bailur. The path led in a generally southwesterly direction, alternatively through sparsely cultivated country and scrub jungle, which skirted the ranges of small hills lying a couple of miles southward, within the boundaries of the reserved forest proper. I passed a few hamlets, but all the inhabitants were either indoors or squatting at the entrances of their huts. Their few cattle were kraalled outside, or grazed at will on the scant herbage in the immediate vicinity of the huts, for the story of the man-eater had spread far and wide, and the usual scare that attends such visitations had already set in. I walked slowly, making inquiries wherever possible. Almost all the Soligas inhabiting these hamlets reported that they had heard a tiger roaring in the vicinity, either the previous night or within the past 72 hours. At one spot, I was shown the clear pug marks of a tiger, as it had crossed a recently plowed field, just 100 yards from the owner's hut. I took detailed measurements of those pugs for future reference before moving on, but it soon became evident that the people in this area were either so nervous that they were making completely false and exaggerated reports, or else that an unusual number of tigers were operating along the 19 miles between Ramapuram and Bailur. For, according to the information obtained, a tiger appeared to have visited each hamlet within the last 3 or 4 days. At about 5 p.m., I approached Bailur, a village of some 20 huts. Here, I met members of the road gang, who had witnessed the killing of the woman near the 21st milestone. They told me what I have already recorded and particularly stressed the tiger's deformities, which they had all clearly seen, while they stood rooted to the spot with terror. While the tiger made off into the undergrowth with its still screaming victim, the road coolie woman. The nearest forest department lodge was some 3.5 miles farther along the motor road, in the direction of Dimbam. The reserve lay along both sides of the road. It was now 5:30 p.m., and I knew that night would fall in an hour, so I covered those last 3.5 miles at a brisk pace, reaching the little forest bungalow shortly before dark. The sun had gone down behind the towering range of the Bilagirirangan Hills, which lay some 3 miles west of the bungalow, and the twilight calls of roosting peacock and jungle fowl welcomed me, as I sank into an old broken armchair, which I dragged on to the veranda. The distant challenge of a sambar stag, descending the western range, was music to my ears as it floated across the dense valley, separating the bungalow from the foothills. The myriad treetops of this valley were like a dark carpet, in the deepening twilight. Scarcely half an hour had passed before total darkness prevailed, punctuated by the incessant flicker of a million fireflies. They floated everywhere, like tiny elfin spirits in the gloom, carrying their lanterns of pinpoint brilliance, to every bush treetop in the vicinity. At rare intervals, their flashes would synchronize, and the tree or bush around which they clustered would throb and pulsate to one big and unanimous flash of light, made by thousands of these little creatures. The blackness of the jungle night would disperse, before a phosphorescent and ethereal glow, but only for a moment until that rare interval of synchronization occurred again. I made an early night of it, sleeping on the floor of the small central room of the lodge, but at about 2 a.m., the moaning call of a tiger woke me. I heard it call at intervals as it traversed the valley, until it died away in the distance. Early morning found me back in Bailur village, where I enlisted the help of 2 local shikaris, and purchased 3 young bulls for bait. One of these we tethered in the bed of the stream that traversed the valley west of the bungalow, where I had heard the tiger calling in the night. The second was tied in a small forest glade, a bare 100 yards from the roadside, midway between the village and the forest bungalow. To tie the third, we walked back to the 21st milestone, where the road worker had been killed. Close to this spot the road was crossed by a forest stream, known as Kodambettahala. Its banks were clothed with bamboo, except for a small clearing made by the forest department, in which seedlings of various forest plants were being experimentally grown. My helpers told me that a tiger often walked through this clearing, and I found this statement to be true, in that pug marks both old and comparatively new were visible at 3 different places. I examined the most recent of these imprints, and compared them with the measurements of the pug marks taken at the hamlet on the previous day. Both sets had been made by a male tiger, but those in the departmental plantation belonged to a much older and heavier animal. We tied the third bait on open ground, just where the Kodambettahala stream flows past this plantation. When all this had been done it was 5:30 p.m., and on our return to Bailur village I was approached by a sturdy, good-looking Soliga, who introduced himself as Jekan, the husband of the girl who had been the man-eater's first victim. He said that a party of travelers who had passed by the coffee estate on the slopes of Ponakai Malai, where he worked, had informed him that a sahib had come to Ramapuram to shoot the tiger. Filled with the idea of revenge for his wife's murder, he had obtained the planter's permission to go to Ramapuram to offer me his assistance. At Ramapuram, he was told that I had gone to Bailur, whither he had immediately followed me, all by himself. I thanked Jekan for his offer, and the trouble he had taken to find me, and immediately recruited him as my personal helper. I liked his appearance and his calm determination, to leave no stone unturned to bring the tiger to book. Jekan smiled at my acceptance and thanked me in turn, but he staunchly refused to accept any payment. Indeed, he made it abundantly clear that this was the condition of his offer. I returned to the forest lodge, instructing Jekan and the other 2 helpers to make an early start next morning, and visit the bait near the 21st milestone. For myself, I would visit the other 2 baits. This I did next morning, first visiting the bull tethered on the streambard in the valley, then the bait that was tied midway between the forest bungalow and Bailur village. Both were unharmed and no traces of pugs were to be seen, in any sand that existed near the spots where they were tied. I then walked the remaining distance to Bailur village, where I awaited the return of my 3 scouts. Within an hour they arrived, to tell me the third bait was alive. Leaving Jekken and one of the Soligas at the village, I took the second man, who claimed to be well acquainted with the forest game paths in that area, and walked westwards till we entered the foothills of the Bilagiri Rangans. As all this area was unfamiliar to me, I got him to walk in front, while I covered him from the rear with my rifle ready in my hands. Soligas are born jungle folk, and my guide showed no signs of nervousness while we threaded our way thus, in single file, up one game path and down another, across dark nullas, often bending double to avoid overhanging fronds of bamboo or outcrops of wait-a-bit thorn. But no signs of a fresh tiger track did we see. A large male panther had crossed at one spot, and at another spot a female, accompanied by her cub, but it was evident that the tiger we were looking for had not passed that way. It was nearing 3 p.m. before we got back to the forest lodge and a late cold lunch. The Soliga made a fire, on which I boiled some water to brew as several cups of tea. Then I drew water from the little well in the compound, to give myself the luxury of a cold bath. At 5 I returned with the Soliga to Bailur village, where I left him with instructions for Jekken, himself and the third Soliga to visit the bait on the 21st milestone early next morning. It was well past 7 by the time I got back to the bungalow. I slept soundly that night, nor did the moaning call of any tiger disturb me. Early morning found me on my way to visit the other two baits. Both were unharmed. Returning to the forest lodge, I ate a frugal meal and then walked towards Bailur, carefully watching the road for pug marks. No tiger had passed that way, and 9:15 in morning found me awaiting my henchmen. They returned before 10, this time to report that the bait had been killed and removed by a tiger, which had contrived to bite through the tethering rope. Fortunately, I had come prepared for such an eventuality, and had brought my torch and other night shooting kit with me in a haversack. Back we went as fast as we could, and shortly after midday had reached the spot where the bull had been tied. The tiger's pug marks, in approaching the bait, were apparent in the soft earth some 20 feet away, and an examination showed that the killer was a tigress and not a tiger. From there she had launched her final attack, that had killed the bull biting through the rope by which its leg had been tied. We could not know how far the kill had been taken, so I told my companions to wait for me by the 21st milestone till 3 p.m., while I would follow the drag mark. If the dead bull had been taken for some distance, I would try to build myself a hideout to await the return of the tigress, and would make it an all-night affair. Under such circumstances, I would not be back by 3 and they were to return to Bailur. On the other hand, if the tigress had dropped the kill not far away, I would return to my companions and get them to put up a proper makan. I found the tigress had half dragged the kill for the first 200 yards, by which time she had got clear of the bamboo jungle that grew on the lower land and in the vicinity of the stream. Then she had encountered some heavy lantana undergrowth, which had obviously been an obstruction to her passage, encumbered as she was with the dead bull. Here, she had evidently slung it over her shoulder, as tigers sometimes do to carry their kills, and it then became extremely difficult to follow the trail. A dragging hoof, or the horns of the bull, had here and there broken a twig, and these were the only visible signs of passage. The carpet of rotting vegetation, and fallen lantana leaves, effectively did away with any hope of finding pug marks. Necessarily, the going was also very slow, nor did I like the situation at all, as almost my whole attention had to be given to following the trail, which prevented me from being fully on my guard against a sudden attack. Finally, the lantana gave way to more open forest, sprinkled liberally with trees and a carpet of the dwarf date palm. Twice, I came across the spot where the tigress had laid down her burden, and then picked it up again. It was now evident that she had some particular destination in view, most probably a lair where she had cubs to whom she was taking the meat. Up and up led the trail. The terrain became more and more rocky, till finally, in a break among the tree trunks, I saw a hillock, perhaps a quarter of a mile beyond and about 200 feet above the spot where I stood. The trail led directly toward the hillock. By now I felt reasonably certain that the animal I was following was not the man-eater, because all the data gathered about the man-eater had classed it as a tiger and not a tigress, although the sex factor was not an established certainty. As it was a known fact, however, that the man-eater had lost its left eye and ear, if I could but catch a glimpse of the animal I was following, I would soon know whether it was the right one or not. How to catch that glimpse was the problem. The obvious answer to it was to keep advancing till we met, but it was scarcely to my liking, as even if the tigress was not the man-eater, she certainly was unlikely to welcome any human being who knocked at the door of the lair where she had her cubs. But I went forward. The trail was now easier to follow, as the tigress had brushed against boulders and rocks, where smears of blood betrayed the passage of the dead bull. Half the distance was covered now, the other half would bring me to the summit. The boulders lay in heaps, and the trail I was following wound in and out between them, as the tigress picked her path to avoid any part of her burden, becoming jammed between the rocks. It was 10 minutes to 3. The sun beat down mercilessly on the bare rocks, which in turn threw the heat back in my face as from the door of a furnace. My clothes were soaked with perspiration, which ran in rivers down my face, getting into my eyes, which burned and smarted, and into the corners of my mouth. I licked my lips, and I remember that almost unconsciously, in the excitement of the moment, I noted the salty taste. My rubber boots made no sound, as I negotiated the heated rocks. One corner after another was turned, and at each turn I knew what lay beyond. Then I came upon a shelving rock, which met the rising ground at an angle of perhaps 300, forming a shallow recess rather than a real cave. Two large balls of russet brown, striped with black, white underneath, were tumbling over one another in a vigorous game of catch as catch can. They were two tiger cubs, and they were playing. I stopped in my tracks, the only movement being an imperceptible cocking of the rifle, with the faintest of clicks. But it was enough. Although they were only cubs, generations of instinct were behind them. They stopped playing, disentangled themselves, and looked at me in alarm. Even now, I can picture the scene, one cub with a look of innocent surprise, and the other with its features wrinkled to emit a hiss of consternation. That hiss was the signal for all hell to break loose, for it awoke the tigress, who was sleeping. With a series of shattering roars, she dashed out of the cavern, vaulted over the cubs and came straight at me. The distance may have been 20 yards. I covered her between the eyes as she advanced. Then 5 yards away she stopped. She crouched with her belly to ground, eyes blazing and mouth wide, while her roars and snarls shook the very ground on which I stood. She was a perfect specimen, but certainly not the man-eater. Wonder of wonders. She had not charged home. Her courage had failed her at the last moment. She was telling me, in the simplest of languages, "Get out quickly, and don't harm my cubs or I will kill you." I was glad to oblige. Step by step, I retreated backwards, while never removing my eyes from hers, never allowing the rifle sights to waver in the slightest, my forefinger still on the trigger. And she remained where she was. It was as if she understood that I was going. I realized, at that moment, that she did not want to harm me, that she was only protecting her cubs. Perhaps, she was afraid. I was afraid too. But I did not want to harm her, nor destroy that lovely happy little family. So, I continued to retreat backwards. The tigress continued to roar. Now I had turned the corner of the first rock that hid her from view. Only then did I dare to take a hasty glance backwards, to see where I was walking, although I still faced towards the tigress, who had now stopped roaring, but was still growling. I knew that, as long as she continued to make those sounds, I was safe. I would know where she was. Another big boulder was passed, then I turned and beat a hasty retreat before she had time to change her mind and come after me. She stopped growling, and I knew that the real danger had come. She might have gone back to her cubs, or she might be following. I made down the hill as rapidly as possible, glancing frequently behind me. Soon I came to the trees and the date palms, then the lantana belt, up which I had so laboriously followed the trail, and finally to the bamboos and the road. It was 4:30 p.m. and as instructed, my companions had returned to Bailur. I had 9 miles to cover, and only 2 hours before darkness fell. Nevertheless, I sat by the roadside for 5 minutes to enjoy a quick smoke. I felt I deserved it. I was thankful, too, that I had not been forced to shoot the tigress, for the sight of those 2 cubs was still fresh in my memory. It was past 6:30 before I reached Bailur village. There my 3 companions awaited me, eager to hear my story. When I had told it, they agreed that it was unusual for a tigress to have failed to press home her charge. Darkness had set in by the time I left the little village on the last lap of my journey to the forest bungalow. But as one of our baits was tied at a point about halfway between the village and the bungalow in a glade not far from the road, it occurred to me that I would pay it a visit. Why this idea came to me, I cannot tell particularly, as I had already looked at it that morning on my way to Bailur. It was an impulse, and I have spent my life responding to impulses. I turned off along the little footpath that led away from the road towards the clearing where the bait was tied. It was quite dark, except for the diffused glow from the stars that shone brightly in a clear blue-black sky. The bushes around me assumed ghostly shapes, and the wind sighed fitfully among the branches of the rain tree that bordered the road. Now and again, a large teak leaf fluttered to the ground with the softest of sounds, like some huge moth of the night settling down to rest. I came up to the small wild fig tree, beneath which my bait was tied. The shadows were deeper there, and the bait was, moreover, a brown one. I could not see it till I came very close, when it lumbered to its feet, as if startled at my approach, even as I was startled by its sudden action. It was still unharmed. I walked around it to the other side, to inspect the rope that held it by the hind leg, in case it had become twisted. And at that moment the man-eater charged. It was fortunate for me that I had moved to the other side of the bull, which consequently came between me and the tiger. But I confess that I was taken totally by surprise. There was tremendous woof from the jungle from which I had just emerged. The bull swung round. I leaped behind it, with my back to the trunk of the fig tree, almost tripping over the tethering rope. A huge grey shape vaulted onto the back of the bull, which collapsed beneath the sudden weight. But the tiger had not seized the neck or throat. It had simply leaped upon the bull in order to reach me beyond it. Luckily, in falling the bull ruined the tiger's spring, which otherwise would have followed within a split second. The tiger was extricating itself from the heaving body of the fallen bull, when my bullet smashed between its eyes. Convulsively, it twisted backwards, still lying across the bull, which now staggered to its feet with the tiger over its back, the head and forequarters sagging forwards. Automatically, and without thinking, I fired my second shot at a spot which I judged to be behind the tiger's left shoulder. The bull collapsed. The tiger rolled off the bull and towards me, as my third shot took it in the throat. The bull never moved. The tiger kicked convulsively. And then at last all was still. The light from the torch on the rifle revealed that my first bullet had smashed the tiger's skull. My second had been too low. The heavy .405 missile had plowed through the end of the tiger's chest, and blown a tremendous hole in the bull's side. My third bullet, a quite unnecessary one, had passed through the tiger's throat, leaving a gaping hole. But I had killed the poor bull that had unwittingly saved my life. My hands were trembling, my knees wobbled, and suddenly I felt very, very sick. The reaction, after the events of that evening, was sudden. I sat on the ground, with my back to the fig tree, and raised my hand to my forehead, which I was surprised to find icy cold to my touch. How long I remained thus I do not know. Then I groped for my pipe, filled and lit it. The first few puffs steadied my badly shaken nerves, and I was soon able to get back to the road, and retrace my steps to Bailur village. I found the inhabitants gathered in the streets, agog with excitement and anticipation. For the surrounding hills had carried the sound of my 3 shots, which had reverberated across the valleys and stony ridges. They had guessed I had been attacked on the way to the bungalow, but were wondering whether it had been by the man-eater, or some bear or elephant. Seeing me emerge from the gloom, they rushed forward to welcome me, my 3 servants well to the fore. I sat down by the roadside and told them the story. Gasps of amazement and incredulity broke from their lips, to be followed by congratulations and a fervent expression of thanks for my safety. A chati of fresh hot milk was set before me, and a bunch of bananas. As gifts go, it was not much, but it conveyed the heartfelt thanks of the villagers. In another half hour, practically the whole village had assembled with lanterns and kerosene torches, a stout pole and coils of rope, to bring in the tiger. Back we went to the spot and over 50 people surveyed the strange scene, their eyes wide open with amazement. Jekan was especially pathetic to watch. With his knife he started to stab the dead tiger to my dismay, for he was doing further damage to a skin already well nigh ruined by my bullets. Gently, but firmly, I drew him off. Then he began to weep unrestrainedly, thinking of his dead wife. The deep-hearted weeping of a strong and brave man is not pleasant to witness. It is infectious, and I felt a strange lump rising in my own throat, a lump which refused to subside for quite a time. Not much remains to be told, except for a strange sequel. Next morning, when coming to the bungalow, Jekan passed the spot where I had left the road the previous night. 50 yards further on he decided to answer a call of nature, and stepped behind a star plum bush for the purpose. There he discovered for the first time that the tiger had been lying in wait for me the previous night. Evidently it had been in the vicinity, and had either seen or heard me approaching along the road. Jekan told me what he had discovered, and I walked back with him to check it for myself. I found what he said was true. There, clearly impressed on the soft sand, were tiger's pug marks, while the soft grass and rank weeds beneath the star plum bush were still partly flattened by the weight of the tiger's body, although more than 12 hours had passed since he had lain there in ambush, awaiting my approach. Yet some people tell me that there is no such thing as providence, a guiding spirit, intuition, or a sixth sense. Call it what you will. I find it more difficult to understand the disbelievers than understand providence itself.
The end.